Hi everyone, welcome to the tutorial for photosynthesis and cellular respiration. I'm going to let you know ahead of time that this is some pretty complex stuff, so I strongly encourage you to pause this, especially in between photosynthesis and respiration. In fact, there's a couple of spots in photosynthesis I'd consider pausing it and just giving your brain a break because it gets fairly complex. Our goal here is to develop a model to show how photosynthesis and cellular respiration transform and use energy. And that's exactly what's happening here is we are transforming solar energy, light energy, into energy that can be used by living things. And it starts, it's photosynthesis, but you even use photosynthesis. It's just in a roundabout way. So there are these two processes, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, that use this energy. And it's a really unique, very, very interesting chemical pathway that involves lots of chemical reactions. But in the end, it's even. It works to where all the molecules that are used in one are used in the other, back and forth, and it shows you a flow of energy that is sustainable. It can be done from now on, and the energy that you're using right now came from sunlight, either days ago, weeks ago, months ago, years ago, depending on the food you're eating, and it's a very I always love it. I kind of think it's neat how it works out, but we've got to talk about how this is done down to the atomic level, and so it gets a little complex. So stick around and don't get lost on me. And if you get overwhelmed, just pause it. So we're going to start out with this. Here's the idea of what happens. You've got sunlight, and you got these structures that are mostly, well, this is kind of surprising. Everybody thinks it's mostly plants, but believe it or not, there's more photosynthesis done in the ocean with algae and other photosynthetic organisms in the ocean than there is from plants. Plants do a great job. The earth is covered in them, and everywhere you see a plant, photosynthesis is occurring. And essentially, what at a basic level, carbon dioxide goes in that comes out from the air, water goes in from the roots, and sunlight energy goes in. That's what goes into this process, whether it's a plant or an algae or seaweed, which is some kind of protist. Okay, all of them go through a very similar pathway. Now, there are some slight differences, but it's hardly worth noting. But sunlight energy goes in, carbon dioxide gas goes in, water goes in. Now, this carbon dioxide gas, by the way, is what is implicated mostly in global warming. And if we can get this process to happen more, we can actually reduce global warming. That's why we say plant trees. Plant trees left and right. Quit cutting down trees and start planting trees, because it's pulling down all the carbon dioxide, or it's pulling a lot of carbon dioxide out of the air. And in fact, if we ever have any hope of reversing this warming trend, it's going to be from cultivating plants or other photosynthetic organisms. Now, there's structures inside of the plant called a chloroplast. We'll take a close look at that in just a minute. And inside of that are these pigments called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll are little molecules. When you think of pigments, you really should think color. It's these little molecules that are basically give the plant their green color. But what they really do, all pigments collect light energy and convert it to something else. And in this case, chlorophyll collects light energy and starts the process of turning it into sugar or glucose. So to be clear, that's what comes out. A byproduct of this, it's just kind of like the plant's like, gosh, get this away from me, I don't need it anymore. It's oxygen, right? And then, of course, the whole goal here is for the plant to produce this thing called glucose. Now, we've talked about glucose before, but just a quick reminder, the plant uses glucose for food, energy, but it also uses glucose to build the structures. A lot of what you see in a plant is made out of glucose, because that's what the cell walls are made out of. So a very useful molecule, and the plant can use it to just as glucose, or it can combine it together to make cellulose, which is what builds the plant structure, or it can metabolize it in one of its organelles to make lipids and waxes and other types of things. Um, it's unbelievable what the plant does with glucose. So this process is called photosynthesis. And by the way, one other thing is that this structure, because it absorbs light energy, or what we call inorganic energy, because it absorbs light energy, it is an autotroph. It is what we call a self-feeder. That's what autotroph literally means. It absorbs light energy and takes care of itself. It does not require living things to take care, other animals to come along and eat it. All it needs is some decomposers in the ground to decompose the old plants and release the nutrients back into the ground so that it can pull it in, and to release carbon dioxide back into the air to do again. That's all it needs. So whenever an animal comes along and eats it, it's not like the plant's going, oh, this is my purpose in life, here, let me feed you. That's not what goes on here. It's just that animals increase the food chain significantly, and being an animal, I'm kind of glad we're doing it, but plants don't need that. And I just always like to make that clear with my students, is that it's not a requirement, but it can happen. And so we create this ecosystem, which is important. The most basic ecosystem is just a plant and the decomposer. That's all it's got to have. Sunlight to plant, plant to decomposer. Nutrients from dead plant go back in, and new plants absorb it and do it and make a cycle there. And new sunlight comes in, and the energy flows through. Two things are happening here. Energy is flowing through the ecosystem, and nutrients are being cycled through the ecosystem. Something to keep in mind: eventually, whatever this bird, this hawk, this eagle, looks like an osprey to me, whenever it dies, its nutrients will be put back into the ground and could be used again by a plant. Same thing for the snake, same thing for the mouse, same thing for the praying mantis. Whenever these things die, all of their nutrients go back in the ground, as does the plant. Everything dies, everything gets absorbed by the decomposers, and the decomposers take the large structures and turn them into smaller structures to go back into the ground to be used again. And it all goes back into the plant. So, um, energy is flowing through. The energy goes in here, then it goes here, then here, then here, then here, and then it actually goes out to all of these when they get energy, because that's the reason things eat other things, is to get energy and nutrients. But the energy flows through them, and all the energy that goes in eventually goes right back out in the form of heat. So it may be stored. It may be stored for days or weeks or months or years or thousands of years. Petroleum is millions and billions of years old, but it's still just stored sunlight. And eventually, it'll go back out in the form of heat. Okay? Now, the grasshopper, well, let's start with the plant. The plant absorbs the sunlight energy and it stores it through photosynthesis. Then the grasshopper eats the plant, and through a different process called cellular respiration, the grasshopper gets it gets nutrients, and that's not from cellular respiration, but it also gets energy by taking the energy in the sugar molecules that this plant has stored and breaking them down to release and use for energy. And we're going to talk about that. Then the mouse eats the grasshopper. Same thing. Instead of all of the energy in the grasshopper that the grasshopper ate from this plant, instead of it all being used immediately, some of it's stored in various forms. Well, the mouse can eat the grasshopper and get that energy. Then the snake can eat the mouse and get its energy. Then the osprey can eat the snake and get its energy. But then there's energy left in all their bodies even after they're eaten or died or whatever, and that goes to the decomposers. And there are decomposers found in the ground. There are decomposers found underwater. There are even decomposers found in your intestines. Digestion is basically a form of decomposition, if you think about it. Everything in this picture except for the plant is a heterotroph. It can sit out in the sun all day long, but it cannot get energy from the sun. All right, so all animals are heterotrophs, except at the end of this video we're going to look at two small exceptions to that rule. There's always an exception to the rule. All animals are heterotrophs, all fungus are heterotrophs. That's just the way they work. Okay, moving on. Now, when we look at reactions inside of an organism, two things are happening, and I don't want you to complicate this. I want you to just remember this as being very easy. We have smaller molecules such as carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We take energy and we use the energy to arrange those molecules in one larger molecule, such as sugar. But there's energy found in the sugar. So now this larger molecule is smaller molecules arranged in such a way that the bonds between them hold energy. That's called an anabolic reaction. That's what happens. The energy, the plant, for example, through photosynthesis, takes in energy, takes smaller molecules, puts them together to create a larger molecule. That's an anabolic reaction. Happens all the time. And there's all kinds of anabolic reactions. They're not just photosynthesis, but this is the one we're going to be talking about, so it's why we're covering anabolic reactions. But energy in smaller molecules. The energy is used to take the smaller molecules and arrange them together, kind of like playing Legos. Okay? and putting them together to create a larger structure. It's just like Legos, except that every time we connect a Lego, we're actually storing energy. Okay? The opposite of that is the catabolic reaction, where we take that larger molecule and all those bonds in between, all right, and we break those bonds, releasing energy to be used to do work. Lift your arm. You're doing it right now, right? And what's left over are smaller molecules. Now, what's really, 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 really cool is that, check this out, the smaller molecules that are released here are the same smaller molecules that are used here. And the large molecule that's produced here is the same large molecule that's used here. And if you notice it, you can get a cycle in which we could do this over and over again as long as we keep adding energy. Energy goes in here, energy comes out here. You do this moment by moment about 1 billion times a second, because this is how every bit of energy in your body has ever gotten there. This is an example of the sunlight energy coming in, this plant storing that, and then you eating the plant and releasing the energy. So remember this anabolic and catabolic reaction concept, because we're going to talk about it again very shortly, and I'll bring the picture back just to help you out. Okay. Yep. Now we're going to talk about something called ATP. Now, I know that I've talked to you about sugar a lot, as in sugar is the molecule of energy, and it is. We store sugar, not we store fats, but plants store sugar and other things like lipids and fats and waxes that they make from sugar, but they don't really use the sugar molecule as energy. They break that sugar molecule apart in that anabolic reaction, okay? They break that sugar molecule apart in that that's a catabolic reaction. All things do it. Here's the sugar molecule. They break it apart, and they use an intermediate structure called ATP to use for actual energy. I want you to think of ATP as like batteries, but like rechargeable batteries, okay? And notice this structure here. Look how it's the same. This from here to here and over to here, right here. This is called an adenosine monophosphate. Mono means one. That means there is one phosphate group. See that P? That's a phosphate group. This adenosine monophosphate has one phosphate group. This is ADP, adenosine diphosphate. It's the same thing, except it's got another phosphate group hanging off of it. And then there's ATP, adenosine. I bet you can guess what that T stands for. Adenosine triphosphate, because look, it's got 1, 2, 3 phosphates hanging off of it. But what's really, really special is right there, that bond between that oxygen and that phosphorus, right there. That's the energy that your body, well, actually, it's right there. That's the energy that your body uses every time it does something, almost every time. Okay, it can use this too, but this is broken. This bond is broken and made all the time. When we go through respiration, which we're going to talk about in a minute, we actually take adenosine diphosphate. We take adenosine triphosphate and we break that bond, and this phosphate floats away, but we use that energy, and we're left with ADP and a phosphate floating over here. Now, our bodies then take sugar and use the energy in sugar to put that phosphate back on there and turn it back into ATP. And this process of using the ATP to do work, and then it's being broken down to ADP and a phosphate, then that goes back to something called a mitochondria. We'll talk about it later in the video. They put it back together to make ATP, and we do it again and again and again. I think of it as like a charged and an uncharged battery, like rechargeable batteries. Here's the battery all charged up. It's got that phosphate hanging off the side. It's all charged up. It's ready to be used. But the moment you use it, the battery goes dead. What do you do to a dead battery? You charge it back up. When it's a dead battery, ADP, you can think of D for dead, although it's not really dead. I'm just letting you know. We can use that bond there and even that bond there if we have to, but that's another argument. But it's like a dead battery, okay? You send it back to the battery charger where it gets charged back up by putting that phosphate back on there. And then it's back out and go again. You're ready to go. And so it creates this cycle of using these molecules. And this is what everything uses ATP. Everything on Earth uses ATP as its energy molecule. It's crazy. Plants do it. Animals do it. Fungus does it. Okay. But we don't eat foods full of ATP. We eat foods full of sugar, and we use that sugar to charge up the ADP into ATP. Okay. Now, ATP is made lots of ways. Plants make ATP when they do photosynthesis, but it's usually used to finish the process, but you know, it's everywhere. So if you see ADP and ATP as we go through this process, don't be surprised. Now, we're going to take you through the process of photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is a very complex process. It's what's called a biochemical pathway, meaning that it is a series of chemical reactions that go in order to create an end product. That's called a biochemical pathway. Think about a pathway. If you, my grandmother used to have these footstep shaped walkway stones up to her house. Instead of having like just squares, she had them shaped like footsteps. And when I was a little kid, I'd try to make sure I could step in each one because that's what you're supposed to do. She just thought they were cute. But whenever I think of a biochemical pathway, I think about those steps because a biochemical pathway, each step is a chemical reaction. And what you start out with a chemical reaction, and chemical reactions have reactants and products. So a reactant goes in and a product comes out. But that product in the first chemical reaction becomes the reactant in the next chemical reaction, and then it goes on again and creates another product, and that becomes the next reactant, and that creates a product, the next reactant, and you go through a series of steps. It may be as simple as 3 steps, or it may be as complex as 100 steps. But every time you have a step, one reaction produces a product, which becomes the reactant in the next reaction. And it goes all the way through until you produce your final product. Photosynthesis is that way. We've got stuff going in, and then through a series of chemical reactions, at the end we've got something coming out. Actually, a couple of things. Okay. So let's take a look at that reaction. Before we do, let's talk about where it happens. This is a chloroplast. Inside of any photosynthetic organism, you're going to find these chloroplasts. They're structures, and inside of those structures are even more structures called thylakoids. And all I want you to think about any of these is just like a cell. This is like a miniature cell. The membrane is exactly the same as a cell membrane, and it's got stuff on the inside. The stroma, I'm sorry, on the inside, like that thick, snotty-like stuff, just like cytoplasm. Okay. And here's something crazier. If you go look at these thylakoids, they look kind of like flat pancakes, but they're more like jelly-filled donuts, really. And they have, if you zoom in on them, right there, they have a membrane, just like this membrane for the chloroplast, just like the cell membrane. They have a membrane, and in the membrane of the thylakoid is where the first process occurs. It's light sensitive. It requires light to make it happen, and so therefore we call it the light dependent reactions. That's what phase 1 is the light dependent reaction. Now here we are, we're looking at it, and this is the thylakoid membrane. Now remember, the thylakoid is that little guy right there. It's inside of the chloroplast, which is inside of the cell. So when you see this membrane, we're not looking at a cell membrane, we're looking at the thylakoid membrane. But it looks a lot like the cell membrane, and there's a reason for that we'll talk about some other day. But you'll notice that embedded in the membrane, just like in a cell, you've got all these little structures, okay? And this is where the magic happens. The light dependent reactions, this is where the magic happens, okay? Now, a lot of this depends on there being an inside of the thylakoid and the outside, and that creates what we call a potential. All right, and because the sunlight hits these things called these are the chlorophyll, because the sunlight hits these chlorophyll, all right, the chlorophyll grabs the sunlight energy and does something pretty awesome with it. This is incredibly complex. Don't even think that I understand all of it. You have to have a degree in biochemistry to get everything that's going on here. But it is a series of chemical reactions, and in every chemical reaction something goes in and something comes out, and what comes out of one goes into the next to create a new thing, and what comes out of the next goes into the third to create a new thing, and it keeps going on and on and on. And there's numerous steps, and then this is only half of it. There's a whole nother bunch of steps that happens out in the stroma called the light independent phase, because it doesn't require light. So this is called the electron transport chain, because essentially what's happening is we're moving an electron from here all the way through here. Now you remember electrons, that's what's found in the outer part of an atom. Well, we're moving them, okay? And moving these electrons requires energy. That energy comes from the sunlight. But as we move them, they have to go through these different molecules. And as they do, they end up kind of changing every time, okay? So the problem with photosynthesis is that it's hard to study because you got to kind of study it backwards. You really should start by looking at photosystem 1, but stuff happens in photosystem 1 before you can, so we start with photosystem 2 and then we go to photosystem 1, which is kind of crazy. But here is a hydrogen proton and a bunch of electrons. Guess where these things came from? You'll see in just a second in the second part that it comes from water. We break water apart. Water is a hydrogen and two oxygens. I'm sorry, two hydrogens and oxygen. And you get enough of that water, you can create O2. Okay, this is where the air you breathe is created right here. The hydrogen is broken apart, the water is broken apart. One of the oxygens in one molecule and another oxygen in another molecule are bonded together, and they're done. Go. That's it. That is entirely it. The oxygen is released, and take a deep breath. That's where it comes from. But then you get these four hydrogens that start to do work. Okay. Plus, there's an electron released, and it starts moving through this system. Now, I could get really deep into this and explain it to you, and it requires all this different chemistry, but I just don't see the point in it, because you you don't need to learn it right now, and you don't want to learn it. I promise you, it's just that difficult. But notice, we start out with water, we start out with light, we release oxygen. Okay, if you want to keep track, this is where all the oxygen comes from. The water goes in, oxygen comes out, and parts of the water and a few other things go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, using the energy of the sunlight through a couple of different structures, a couple of different chlorophyll structures, and a couple of other things. But at the end of it, they create some interesting things. One of the things they create is called NADPH. Now, that is another molecule, kind of like ATP, in which we charge it up by adding a hydrogen to it. Guess where the hydrogen came from, by the way? From the water. We charge it up by adding a hydrogen to it. It's discharged, it's NADP+. Where does that come from? Well, guess what? That's the next reaction. But the NADPH, you take a hydrogen, you add to it. It takes energy to do that. But when you add that hydrogen to the NADP+, you get NADPH, and that is now a charged up molecule that we're going to send to the next reaction because it's ready to go. Plus, you also create a couple of other molecules, FNR and F, whatever that, I think it's a D. It could be an A or a D because the name of it it doesn't matter, okay? By the way, it takes light twice to make that happen. This light here, we grab this electron and we send it zooming down the electron pathway, and as it goes through and it does things, it loses energy, and it's, okay, I'm out of energy, and all of a sudden it gets hit with another sunlight, and zoom, it does it again, and as a result, we've charged up this NADP+ to become an NADPH. That's kind of the goal here, is that in the light dependent reactions, these depend on light to make them happen, you get this NADPH, okay? Now follow along on this because I want you to keep track of that. The NADPH plus another process in here called chemiosmosis is happening at the same time, and I do need to explain that to you because at the same time all that other stuff is happening, a lot of these hydrogens are moving around and all this stuff, and long story short, look what we're doing. We're taking adenosine diphosphate, adding that phosphate through the energy in that hydrogen ion, and we're turning it into ATP. So not only are we making NADPH, we're also making ATP at the same time. So here's where we're making NADPH, but also we're making ATP. Now remember, ATP is like a charged up battery. So at the end of all of this, water went in, sunlight went in, oxygen came out, we're done with the oxygen, but we also made ATP and NADPH. And that's what happens during the light reactions, okay, the light dependent reactions. Now we're going to move on to what's called the light independent phase, because this happens without any sunlight. This does not require sunlight. It's called the Calvin cycle, and it is a great big cycle, okay? And every time we go through the cycle, we add a carbon to something, but it takes energy to add that carbon, all right? Now what you may not remember is that sugar is a 6-carbon molecule, C6H12O6. It has 6 carbons, and those 6 carbons are what's important. And every time we go through every time we turn the Calvin cycle, one time we add a carbon. So in order to get 6-carbon molecule, guess how many times we got to go through the Calvin cycle? 6 times, okay? Now this is where the carbon dioxide comes in, okay? And this is still happening in the chloroplast, but it's now happening outside in the stoma. But carbon dioxide goes in, the NADPH and the ATP from the light dependent reactions go in, and we turn this a couple of times, and out comes a sugar, okay? So let's take a closer look at this. So here we are at the Calvin cycle, and the Calvin cycle has 3 steps to it, to each cycle, and remember, each cycle only adds 1 carbon, okay? So we're going to do each step 6 times, okay? Each of these 3 steps here is 1 turn equals 1 turn, and we're going to do one turn 6 times. Okay, so the first step is called carbon fixation. You can't see it very well, but basically carbon dioxide comes in, we rip off that carbon. Guess what we do with the oxygen? We throw it away. All right, but that carbon, then we use the energy found in the NADPH and the ATP. Actually, we use that next, but we grab that carbon and we're about to rip that carbon off. So this is called carbon fixation. In the reduction phase, we take the ATP that we produced in photosynthesis and we use it to actually use 2 ATP to stick that carbon on there. Okay, now this is showing you 12, but that's because we got to do it 6 times, don't forget. Okay, so for every carbon that we stick on here, we need 2 ATP, and it sticks it on there, right? And we also use the 2 NADPH during the reduction phase, and we stick it on there, okay? And that NADPH and that ATP came from the the electron transport chain from the light dependent reactions. And we're not through. We got more ATP because in the regeneration phase we got to use even more ATP, a little bit more, and we finally get 2 carbons stuck together. And at the end of the first turn, now instead of having 1 carbon stuck together, we got 2. Okay, well, we need 6, so we got to go through this process a bunch more. And at the end, though, we produce a 6 carbon sugar, and that is the purpose behind photosynthesis. It took all of that process, the electron transport chain, breaking that water molecule, moving that electron around, moving those hydrogen ions around, taking that NADPH and charging it up to NADP, taking all that ADP and charging it into ATP, and doing all that. Then all that comes over here, and we grab the carbon dioxide out of the air, and we put those carbons here, and do it 6 times, and all that just to produce 1 sugar molecule. So do you think this happens a little bit or a lot? I hope you said a lot, because this is happening right now as I'm filming this. The sun is coming up, and it's starting to happen all over the earth right now at an unbelievable scale. You just would not believe how much it's happening. All right, I want to throw something up here because I've lost it. Hang on, where'd it go? Oh, there it is. I want to throw something up there. It's called the balance sheet for photosynthesis. Okay, the simplest chemical equation for photosynthesis is carbon dioxide and water plus light energy gives us a sugar molecule plus oxygen. But we have to balance this out, and if you've never balanced equations, you have to kind of see how this works. So forget this simplest equation, forget this is even here. I want you to learn this one, and you might even want to write this down. It takes 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water molecules plus light energy, but when that's all said and done, we get 1 sugar molecule and a bunch of oxygen thrown away. Now the water goes in the light dependent reaction, I showed you that, okay? And the carbon dioxide goes in the Calvin cycle. And we take a carbon dioxide, every time we take a turn, we take a carbon dioxide, okay? And every time we produce an NADPH in the light cycle, we take a water. But every time we do all that, it all goes through several times, and the next thing you know, boom, you've turned that Calvin cycle enough to get 6 carbons attached, plus all these others, this hydrogen and oxygen, they all stick together. It's like Legos. And remember, there's some byproducts, so that's just thrown away, but there's my sugar, okay? Now, that's important that you see this, because in a minute, we're going to talk about what happens absolutely in reverse, okay? I want to make sure, hang on. And that's the end of photosynthesis. You might want to review it. You might want to watch this again because it's a little complex, but make sure you're reading and taking notes. Because what we're going to be talking about next is what happens when we go through the opposite of this, which is when we take that sugar molecule and we release a whole bunch of energy. So stick around. This is a good time to pause right here and just take a break, because this was some pretty complex stuff. Now that we've built that sugar molecule, okay, now we gotta, what do we do with it? Well, plants can use that sugar molecule to build their structures, okay? Every cell wall is made out of that sugar molecule. Lots of structures like the lipids and the fats and the waxes and stuff that you find in plants, that's built from a sugar molecule. And then, of course, the plant uses, what it mostly does is it uses the sugar to grow. And so as a result, sugar is used a lot. Now, every living thing goes through cellular respiration. Not every living thing goes through photosynthesis, right? I don't go through photosynthesis because I don't have chloroplasts in those structures. But every living thing goes through cellular respiration, and there's 2 kinds of cellular respiration we're going to talk about, but keep in mind, every living thing does this. So Every living thing takes a sugar molecule and does what we're about to do in some format. What's really cool about it is that it's almost the exact reverse, of photosynthesis. Chemically, it looks exactly like the opposite of photosynthesis, with one added thing. One thing that we were able to figure out is that we can take a glucose molecule, that 6 carbon molecule, and break it in half and get 2 ATP out of it. Now we're talking about, whenever you see ATP kind of right now, I want you to think money, okay? And if you went out and let's say a glucose molecule was, I don't know, an orange tree, okay? And all those oranges were money. Wouldn't you like to be able to get as much money off of there as you can? Well, it's the same thing with with cellular respiration. There are ways in which they don't get very much energy, but then there are ways in which you can get all the energy you can possibly get. And so, depending on how complex the organism is, and depending on how if it's figured out how to do these pathways in reverse, it can either get just a little bit or a lot. But the first thing that we're going to do is break that sugar in half and get that glycolysis out. That's the first step in getting ATP. Everybody does it. It's called glycolysis. Then you get 2 ATP from that. Now there are some things that's all they get. Sorry. Maybe they're just too short to reach up in the tree and get more oranges. I don't know. But that's all they get. The rest of the energy is turned into something else. And we'll talk about that. But complex organisms are able to take what's left over after glycolysis and do the reverse. Oh, look, a cycle. Oh, look, an electron transport chain. They're able to do the reverse of photosynthesis and get the energy back out in as much as 34 ATP. If you were picking oranges from a tree and there were 34 oranges on that tree, would you rather get 2 of them or 34 of them? That's what I thought. So, remember, if an organism can, and it's genetic, it's a species thing. You don't just, it's not like you go, well, am I going to do it today or not? You can or you can't, and that's it. And if you can, then you get all 34 ATP. If you can't, you only get the 2 ATP. But if you are that, are you gonna be capable of doing a lot of energy necessary things? And the answer is no. So that's why this is mostly done inside of things like bacteria, because they stay small. They don't use as much energy. All right, let's move on. Glycolysis is the first step. Is pretty straightforward. It actually takes some energy to do this. I have to put in 2 ATP to make this happen. But my body will use 2 ATP, and by the way, this happens inside of the cytoplasm. My body will take 2 ATP and use that energy to, boop, see that 6 carbon glucose? It'll break it apart, and it then releases 4 ATP and 2 things called pyruvates with 3 carbons each. But those 4 ATP, I put 2 in and got 4 out. If there was a machine where you could put in $2 and get out $4, would you do it? Yeah. Well, that's exactly what's happening here. We're investing 2 ATP and getting back 4 for a grand total of, we're making 2 extra ATP here, right? And that's the energy payoff. I put 2 in at the top and I got 4 out here at the bottom. And that's just pretty straightforward. But that's how glycolysis works. Glyco refers to the sugar molecule glucose. Lysis means to break. So glycolysis literally means to break the sugar. And that's about all I have to say about that. It's an energy pathway. It requires some chemical reactions, but we don't need to learn that. Okay? I just break the sugar apart. It takes 2 ATP to break the sugar apart, but I get back 4. I'll do that all day long, right? Now then, after that, there's a little bit of an option, depending on the living thing. Does the living thing go through this process called the Krebs cycle in the electron transport chain? It will if it can, but a lot of living things can't, so they don't. And then they're just stuck with those 2 ATP, and then those 2 pyruvates, they go do something else with it, like make alcohol or lactic acid. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if you can, you're going to take those 2 pyruvates and put them through this reverse process. First the cycle, then the electron transport chain. Remember, the photosynthesis was electron transport chain, then cycle. But we're going to go first the cycle, then the electron transport chain. And every time we turn this thing, carbon is coming out, and so is ATP. And that's how our body works. Okay? Now, you remember how complex the electron transport chain and the Calvin cycle was in photosynthesis? Well, this is just as complex in reverse. You take these pyruvates and you put them in there and you mix them with things called coenzyme A and acetyl coenzyme A and all this other stuff, but what comes out the back is carbon dioxide and ATP. And that's a really cool thing, right? Because, yeah, I'm exhaling the carbon dioxide, but I'm making the ATP. And I'm telling you, every single thing you do, every bit of energy you ever use, comes from using literally billions of these ATP. Okay? Also, from the Krebs cycle, some processes go into the electron transport chain. And this is actually where most of the ATP is made, in the electron transport chain. It takes oxygen to make it happen. Okay? You got to put oxygen in here. This is why we have to breathe constantly, is to get oxygen into this electron transport chain. Now remember, if you remember in photosynthesis, this is where oxygen came out. Well, the reverse is now this is where oxygen goes in. All right, and water, believe it or not, is released. It's a byproduct of this is water is released. Now you need more water than you can make here, which is why you have to drink water. Speaking of which, I'm about to drink some. Okay, so this, I want you to keep in mind, this happens just like the reverse of the of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis occurs inside of something called a chloroplast. This is occurring inside of a kind of a similar structure, but it's called a mitochondria. Mitochondria take sugar in, take oxygen in, they release carbon dioxide, release water, and release a bunch of ATP. And inside of it, all the special little mechanisms are the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Krebs cycle should look a lot like photosynthesis, but the Calvin cycle, but in reverse. We turn it 6 times and we start chiseling away at that carbon molecule. And every time we pop off a carbon molecule, we're able to create several ATP. Okay, so spin it 1 time, ATP comes out, spin it again, more ATP comes out. But every time we spin it, we keep chiseling away and breaking off a carbon that bonds with oxygen and becomes CO2. And we can turn it 6 times. And then after that, though, we're also, don't forget, we're also making FADH and a couple of other things that go over here to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain takes the FADH and the NADH. I guess they didn't show you making the NADH over here. It's made over here. Well, there it is. It's made right there, and the FADH is made here. And then that goes over here to the electron transport chain, and boop, goes all through and releases a lot more ATP and some hydrogen, which is bonded with water to make, I'm sorry, bonded with oxygen to make water. Oxygen goes in, water comes out. This all happens just like we showed you in the other thing. It happens in the membrane of the mitochondria. Okay, I mean, this, I'm really trying to show you how the exact reverse it is of photosynthesis. Okay, and then of course it requires ATP. I'm sorry, it makes ATP through chemiosmosis. So again, our whole goal here is to make ATP, but in this case, this is the opposite of the sun. We have finally gotten to the end of the electron transport chain, and in photosynthesis, this is where sunlight went in and it did the reverse, but now we're at the end of respiration. This is where energy comes out. Of course, that energy ultimately started with the sun, but this right here, these ATP, is what you use all day long to do everything in your body, and it requires that sugar to start with, and that sugar, of course, came from photosynthesis. So it's a complex mechanism, and before I talk to you about that, I want to show you this. This is everything put together. Okay, this is how energy flows through an ecosystem. The light energy goes into to the chloroplast. The photosynthesis absorbs the light energy and creates glucose, and it releases oxygen. Okay, inside of the mitochondria, glucose goes in, oxygen goes in, and what is released is energy, chemical energy like ATP, and carbon dioxide and water. And that carbon dioxide and water goes right back here, and it makes a cycle. Notice that the matter, the glucose, the oxygen, the water, the carbon dioxide, by the way, these things are just made of these things, and these things are like Legos. They're busted apart and turned into these things. That's what happens inside of the mitochondria, and then these things take these things, right? The chloroplasts take the water and carbon dioxide Legos and put them back together to create glucose and oxygen. But in that glucose is a lot of energy stored, and that energy is released. So the matter, or the mass, all these atoms make a big cycle, but the energy flows through. The light energy goes into here, and then it's stored here, and it's released here and comes out this way. So we've got matter being cycled here and energy flowing through. And it's important that you guys see that, okay? Now this is a perfect situation right here, and this can last forever and forever and forever. But remember at the beginning of cellular respiration, the first thing we did is we broke that glucose in half, called glycolysis, and released those 2 ATP. There are some organisms on Earth that that's all they can do, and as a result, it doesn't happen the rest of the way, like I just showed you with the oxygen. See, if you don't have oxygen, or sometimes oxygen is poisonous to you, you actually do something else, and it's called anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic means without oxygen. So when there's no oxygen available, or oxygen is poisonous to you, you can't use oxygen, you actually go through a slightly different process to where all you do is that glycolysis at the beginning. And that's it. After glycolysis, those 2 pyruvates are then taken and done something else with, and they're used to turn into things like alcohol or lactic acid. Now, if you've ever seen anything made with alcohol, literally the alcohol that you get in a can of beer or a glass of wine or something else, or alcohol like the doctor uses, like when they rub on your shoulder before they give you a shot, or the ethanol that we put in our car, it's all done the same way. You give things like bacteria, mostly these simple organelles, organisms like the simple single-celled bacteria, but sometimes multicellular organisms, although I don't think multicellular organisms want to do it. You can do this. It's not good for you, but this happens. But these simple single-celled organisms will take this sugar and break it apart, get the ATP for them to live, and then they make for you something like alcohol. This happens in all kinds of situations. This happens all over the place. Actually, when they make bread, bread is a form of fermentation. And so this is a very common but much simpler pathway besides cellular respiration. This is anaerobic respiration. And the main thing is there's no oxygen, and the main thing is it makes a lot less ATP. And instead of making a whole bunch of ATP, it makes a little bit of ATP and something else like lactic acid. All right? So this is it, looking at it in 2 ways. Lactic acid fermentation happens in animals, and some bacteria can do it. This is what we use to make yogurt and cheese and that sort of stuff. It happens in our muscles, and basically after glycolysis, those pyruvates are turned into lactic acid. Another type of pathway is when organisms, and all kinds of things can do this too, but they take that glucose, and when they break it in half, that pyruvate becomes ethyl alcohol or another type of alcohol. But it's a pretty easy thing. But keep in mind, in this whole thing, we're only making 2 ATP. So where we could make 34 ATP if we had oxygen and the right structures, we only make 2 ATP. So we don't get as much energy. So we're not going to do as well. That's why in order for complex organisms like multicellular organisms such as humans or trees or whales or something, this isn't going to work. You just cannot get enough energy. So you have to go through that cellular respiration, which uses oxygen, and then that oxygen is used to make more ATP, and you can do a lot more growth and development with that. So here's something weird. I told you that only plants and other things like seaweed and algae and stuff go through photosynthesis. Well, guess what? There's always an exception. Believe it or not, there are 2 organisms, 2 animals that we have discovered that actually go through photosynthesis. This little guy right here, I forget what it's called. Does it say it as a spotted salamander, Ambystoma maculatum? See the little green spots on it? It's actually got algae up under there, but also it's its own structures, and these green spots will absorb sunlight and give this thing to some degree some sugar. Nowhere near enough for this thing to live, so it still has to eat things, but it can actually absorb sunlight and use that to make sugar, which is crazy. But it still has to eat stuff, so it's not totally photosynthetic, but it can do it. Okay, and there's apparently a handful of things that can do this, but keep in mind, they can't survive just off of the photosynthetic energy that they pull in. They have to eat other things. Here's another picture of something called a sea slug right here. This sea slug does the same thing, but you know, they still have to eat stuff, right? So I just thought I'd show you those things real fast because they're kind of interesting, but they're kind of the exception to the rule. And that pretty much wraps it up, everybody. Um, that's a real quick look at photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And, and I know you're thinking that was quick. Yeah, there are people who get PhDs in this kind of stuff. And we just took a real simple look at the most basic parts of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Do yourself a favor, make sure you're taking good notes. Also, you might want to write down you might want to write down everything that goes into and comes out of photosynthesis and respiration. Okay? In photosynthesis, carbon dioxide goes in, water goes in, sunlight goes in. Out comes sugar and carbon dioxide. I'm sorry, out comes sugar and oxygen. And then it's the exact opposite for, nope, not that, sorry. Hold on, let me find it. Where is it? Where did you go? Right here. This is photosynthesis. In goes carbon dioxide and water and light energy, and out comes sugar and oxygen. If you just flip this around, where these were in the front and these were in the back of this arrow, okay, or you just flip this arrow around, either way, that's respiration. You really ought to write that down, okay? And in fact, I'm going to leave that on the screen until I'm done. Oh, no, I'm not, because I want to show you this. Remember the anabolic and catabolic reactions? Photosynthesis is anabolic. It takes the energy and it uses these smaller molecules, hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, to create sugar. And respiration, cellular respiration, is catabolic. I take that big sugar and I break it down into those smaller molecules and release energy. Okay? Remember that. And now I'm going to leave this up on the screen, and that's going to be where I leave you. I know this is hard to get. Study it and do your best. Thank you.